I sat at the edge of the mahogany table, hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my breath even. The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice smooth and detached, like he had done this 100 times before. To him, it was just another wealthy family, another awkward room filled with suits and strained smiles. To me, it was a funeral in disguise. My father, Dean Hart, sat straight-backed at the head of the table, flanked by my mother and my older sister, Bianca. They looked calm, certain, like they already knew how this would play out. And maybe they did. Mr. Jensen, the attorney, looked up and read the will my father had prepared 2 months before his passing. Bianca received $10 million in liquid assets and full ownership of Heart Diagnostics, the medical lab empire our family had run for 3 generations. There was applause from my mother, a nod from Bianca, and then he read my name. To my younger daughter, Evelyn Hart, I leave a personal letter. Silence. No money. No shares. Not even a token gesture like a watch or a painting. Just a sealed envelope. I didn't react. I didn't want them to see the burn behind my ribs. I reached out, took the letter, and placed it gently in my bag without opening it. My mother didn't even look at me. She just sighed and said flatly, "Your choices were never practical, Evelyn. You wanted to save the world. Go ahead. Just don't expect us to pay for it." Bianca let out a quiet laugh. I wasn't sure if it was pity or pride. Maybe both. I didn't speak. I just stared at the edge of the table, tracing the grain with my fingertip. I could hear my pulse in my ears. That's when Mr. Jensen spoke again. "There is one more document," he said carefully. "This one was not written by your father. It was submitted to my office 3 years ago with explicit instructions. It is to be read only in the presence of the entire family." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn manila envelope sealed with red wax. The name on it was handwritten, slanted, familiar. Josephine M. Hart, my grandmother. My mother's mouth twitched. Bianca shifted slightly in her seat. My grandmother had died almost 2 years ago. I hadn't even known she had left anything behind, let alone something that required a lawyer. Mr. Jensen looked at me. "This document, Miss Hart, is addressed primarily to you." I blinked. My throat tightened. My father's will had just erased me, and now somehow my grandmother's voice was about to rise from the grave. The wax cracked softly as Mr. Jensen broke the seal. He unfolded the parchment carefully, revealing a letter with slanted script written in dark blue ink. My grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable, neat, but urgent, like she had written it with a deadline hanging over her. He began reading aloud. "To my granddaughter, Evelyn Hart. If you are hearing this, it means you were brave enough to come. That matters more than you know." The room shifted. I could feel Bianca watching me now, her usual confidence cracking just slightly. The letter continued. "Evelyn, I watched you grow up in the shadow of practicality, in a home where compassion was treated like weakness. I saw the way your light dimmed every time someone told you that your work was too soft, too sentimental, too pointless. But I saw the truth. The letter described memories I hadn't even realized she held on to. Me bringing home handmade cards from my students. Me crying after a parent-teacher conference because a 6-year-old told me she felt safest at school. Me spending weekends volunteering at shelters while Bianca was at fundraisers. I closed my eyes as Mr. Jensen kept reading. "You are the one I chose to carry on what truly matters." She wrote of a place I had only heard mentioned in passing, the Haven, a small property in northern Vermont that she had bought in the 1970s. Originally a farmhouse, later converted into a safe home for women and children fleeing abuse. Quiet, undocumented, mostly forgotten. Except it hadn't been forgotten. She had kept it running through private donations, shell companies, and trust accounts, and now she had transferred everything to me, full ownership of the Haven, its staff, its property, and an undisclosed fund of $7.5 million tied to the Josephine Hart Foundation. My mouth went dry. Bianca shifted again. What she whispered. My mother looked pale. "That place, that old house, it still exists, Mr." Jensen nodded. According to Mrs. Hart's instructions, the foundation is fully funded and legally protected. It was structured so no member of the Hart Corporation could claim any authority over it, except for Evelyn. I sat frozen. Me. I wasn't the forgotten one. I was the chosen one. Mr. Jensen pulled out a separate envelope and handed it to me directly. Inside was a key, old silver, slightly tarnished. The back of the letter read, "Use this. The world needs more people like you in charge of something that matters. Not everything has to be built for profit. Go north, Evelyn. Go find what they tried to bury." And that was it. No confrontation, no public shaming, no revenge. Just a door waiting to be opened. When the reading ended, nobody said a word. Bianca was blinking fast. My mother stared at the table, and I stood, slowly, carefully. I put the letter in my bag next to the one from my father still unopened. Then I turned to leave. My father's voice wasn't in the room, but his absence was louder than any words. Outside, the wind felt sharper. I breathed it in like oxygen I hadn't realized I was missing. The next morning, I drove to Vermont. The highway peeled away into winding roads, then gravel paths, and finally a long, narrow drive lined with birch trees. The house at the end was old pale yellow with green shutters and ivy clinging to the porch rails. The haven. It was real. I stepped out of the car, heart pounding. On the front step was a woman in her 50s with a clipboard and soft eyes. She looked like she'd been waiting for me. "You must be Evelyn," she said gently. I nodded. "Welcome home," she whispered. The interior of the haven smelled like lavender and warm bread. It wasn't just a shelter. It was alive. There were crayon drawings taped to the walls. A faint piano melody played from an upstairs room. The floors creaked in familiar, friendly ways, like the house was whispering that it remembered every footstep it had ever held. The woman who greeted me, her name was Martha, walked me through every room with a quiet kind of pride. She wasn't a manager. She was a guardian. This place was built from love, she said, and a whole lot of stubbornness. Martha had worked under my grandmother for more than 20 years. She said Josephine never cared for showy charity or headlines. She just wanted one place in the world where people who had nowhere else could breathe again. Over the next several days, I settled into a small apartment attached to the back of the main house. I read every file, every ledger, every letter my grandmother had left behind, and I found the truth. 4 years ago, my sister Bianca had attempted to purchase the Haven through an LLC she controlled with my parents. She planned to demolish the building and replace it with a boutique wellness spa, something high-end, luxurious, marketable. Josephine had caught wind of the plan just in time. She bought back the deed from a third-party intermediary and restructured all her accounts. That was when she drew up the second will. That was when she chose me. I remember sitting alone in the office with her portrait above the desk. She had this look in her eyes like she knew she had been underestimated her whole life and didn't care anymore. She had protected this place with everything she had left, and now it was mine to carry forward. But the discovery didn't end there. In the bottom drawer of the office cabinet was a locked box. Inside were handwritten evaluations, case notes, progress reports, pages and pages of stories from women who had passed through these walls. Some had escaped violence. Others had aged out of foster care. Some came with babies in their arms. Some came bleeding. One folder had my name on it. It was dated nearly a decade ago. Evelyn, age 22. Volunteer observation report. I read it slowly. My grandmother had documented my weekend visits, how I spoke with the children, how I refilled supply kits, how I once gave my favorite scarf to a teen mother because her baby wouldn't stop crying unless she had something warm to hold. She saw me, even when no one else did. Later that week, I received an envelope in the mail, hand-delivered, no return address. Inside was an invitation. The Hart Foundation Gala. Bianca was the keynote speaker. The foundation run by my family focused on health tech solutions and community outreach. Every year they hosted a benefit gala in New York City. The irony made my throat burn. They had rejected everything I stood for, everything my grandmother believed in, and now They were raising money off the very kind of suffering they ignored at home. Martha looked at me that evening as I held the invitation in my hand. "You don't need to go," she said. "I know," I replied, "but maybe it's time they saw what they missed." That night, I stayed up designing a proposal. The Haven was running, but it could do more. I put together a full expansion plan: satellite houses in rural counties, mental health staff, education scholarships, a reintegration program for women exiting prison. I called it the Josephine Project. I contacted 5 donors I knew through my nonprofit work, then 5 more. I met with the state commissioner. I drafted a new grant template, and I booked a hotel in New York. At the gala, I wore a navy blue suit, the same shade my grandmother always wore when giving public speeches. The ballroom was covered in gold and white linen. People air-kissed each other while checking their phones. Bianca stood near the stage in a sequined gown, shaking hands like a politician. She didn't see me walk in. I waited. When the keynote speaker was introduced, the host announced that the Heart Foundation had partnered with a new initiative, one they hoped would bring real healing into underfunded communities. My name flashed on the screen. The Haven a Reclamation Project, Executive Director Evelyn Hart. Gasps, whispers, and then silence. Bianca's face twisted into something unreadable. The host welcomed me to the stage. My voice didn't shake. I thanked the crowd. I told them about the Haven. I spoke of women whose stories were never printed in glossy brochures. I said healing was not about data points or branding. It was about showing up when no one else did. I ended with my grandmother's words. Legacy isn't built in applause. It's built in silence, in who you show up for when no one's watching. The room stood still. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father clenched his jaw. Bianca blinked rapidly, her lips parted slightly as if trying to remember what page of the script we were supposed to be on. But there was no script anymore, just truth. After the gala, everything changed. News outlets picked up the story. Evelyn Hart, daughter of biotech magnates, had revived a forgotten women's shelter into a state-funded healing network. They called it bold, unconventional. Some called it rebellious. I didn't care what they called it. It was finally seen. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of emails, invitations to speak at conferences, partnership proposals from university social work departments. One woman wrote, "I wish someone like you had run a place like that when I was 16. I might have lived differently." I read it twice, and then I cried. The phone rang later that afternoon. The caller ID read, Bianca Hart. I let it go to voicemail. 3 days later, she showed up at the Haven. She wore sunglasses, no makeup, a gray coat too heavy for the weather. She stood at the gate for a long moment before ringing the bell. Martha answered. She didn't smile. "You can come in," she said, "but only if you're here to listen." I met Bianca in the front hallway. We stood in silence for a full 30 seconds. Finally, she spoke. "You blindsided me." I nodded. "That wasn't untrue." She folded her arms. "I didn't know she left all that to you." "You didn't ask," I replied. Bianca sighed and looked around the foyer. "It's not what I expected." I raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" She hesitated. "I guess I thought you'd burn out, do this for a few months and move on. Like it was a project." "It's not a project," I said. "It's a promise." She nodded slowly. That landed harder than I expected. I didn't offer her a tour. I didn't need to prove anything. Instead, I asked her why she came. She looked out the window. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe I just needed to see what made her choose you." That hit harder than I expected. We didn't cry, we didn't argue. We just stood there, 2 women who grew up in the same house, but entirely different worlds. Before she left, she turned and said, "You know, I gave a lot to the family business, sacrificed a lot. I thought it meant something." "It probably did," I said, "just not to her." She nodded once, tight, then walked away. I watched her leave with no satisfaction, no vengeance, just clarity. The next 6 months were filled with movement. We opened the first satellite home in rural New Hampshire, then another in upstate New York. We hired trauma counselors, launched an anonymous hotline, and built a children's garden where kids could grow their own vegetables and name them after superheroes. I didn't hear from my parents. They sent one email through a legal rep asking if I'd be open to re-engaging privately. I replied, no, thank you. That was the last time they reached out. And somehow that was enough. One night in October, I sat at the main house porch blanket on my lap, watching a young mother named Aaliyah teach her toddler how to walk. The boy was clumsy but determined. He kept falling on the grass and laughing at himself. Martha brought me a cup of tea. Your grandmother used to sit just like that, she said, watching, quietly proud. I smiled. She left me a key, I whispered. Not just to this house, to everything I forgot I deserved. The moon rose over the trees. The porch light flickered once and then steadied. Somewhere in the house a door opened and shut. No fanfare, no announcement, just peace. The first snow came early that year. It dusted the rooftops and softened the edges of the trees surrounding the haven. Children shrieked with laughter in the courtyard building, crooked snowmen with mismatched scarves and button eyes. Someone played a tinny Christmas song from an old speaker near the kitchen window. Inside, it was warm. The fireplace crackled. I sat at my grandmother's old writing desk, the one we'd moved from storage into the corner office. Her photograph sat near the window, a black and white image of her at 28 holding a clipboard and smiling beside the original Haven staff in 1979. She had built all of this when no one believed she could. And now I understood why she left it to me. It wasn't because I was the smartest or the most successful. It was because I had already lived the question. For years I had asked, is being kind ever enough? She had spent a lifetime answering yes, but only if you protect it. That winter we launched the Josephine Fellowship grants for young women going into social work. Within the first month, we received over 400 applications. Some came with stories that made me ache, others with plans for change. All of them had a fire in them I recognized, the kind of fire that doesn't burn for attention but for impact. Every applicant received a personal reply, because no one should feel unseen the way I once did. Bianca started sending handwritten cards twice a year. She never apologized, not directly, but she helped organize donations for the Women's Job Training Program. Once she even came to speak at a quiet alumni dinner, sharing a story about resilience from her hospital days. It wasn't about us. It didn't have to be. We didn't become close, not like sisters in the movies, but she stopped pretending, and I stopped hoping she'd be someone she wasn't. That was enough. One evening, I sat with Martha in the sunroom sipping hot cocoa while she read over a new building proposal. We talked about expanding the program to the Midwest. I mentioned a shelter in Chicago that wanted to join the network. She looked over her glasses and asked, "And how are you, Evelyn?" It caught me off guard. "I'm not trying to prove anything anymore," I said quietly. She smiled. "That's a good place to be." I nodded. It had taken years, but the ache I used to carry of not being chosen, of being the outsider in my own family, had begun to fade. Not because it stopped hurting, but because I stopped needing them to understand. Legacy. I had learned isn't about bloodlines or bank accounts. It's about the people who feel safe enough to exhale because of something you built. It's about creating rooms where no one has to shrink to fit in. It's about answering the questions the world keeps avoiding, about worth, about dignity, about care, and refusing to let those questions go unanswered. And maybe most of all, it's about telling the truth. Not loudly, not vindictively, just consistently. A few months later, I visited my grandmother's grave for the first time since the will reading. I brought lilies, her favorite, and sat cross-legged beside the stone. I told her everything about the programs, the scholarships, the girls who now sleep safely each night, the boy named Ezra who wants to be a lawyer, the mural a group of women painted across the side of the new shelter in Delaware, sunflowers growing out of broken concrete. I told her that I still had the key. I kept it on a chain around my neck, that some days I still felt like I didn't belong in this much light, and that on those days I sat at her desk until I remembered what she saw in me. I told her thank you, and I meant it with everything I had. As I stood to leave, I brushed snow off the top of her stone. Underneath her name were the words she had chosen herself. Build what they say can't be built. Love what they say doesn't deserve it. That spring, I planted a magnolia tree on the front lawn of the Haven. It was small, fragile. I had to brace it with wood beams at first. The wind nearly uprooted it twice, but eventually it held. By summer it bloomed, and I stood beneath it one afternoon watching a group of children chase each other across the lawn, their laughter unfiltered and free, and I realized something I hadn't known I needed. This wasn't a comeback story. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was a beginning. Not the kind my family would ever headline, but the kind that mattered to the right people. I had been erased once, but now I was writing something new. And every time I unlocked the door to the Haven, I remembered, they gave me nothing. She gave me purpose, and I gave myself everything else.